So in the last video, we wrapped up the 8 stages of genocide, and now we are going to move on to the end of this notes section. So I just wanted to let you know that in more recent years, they've added, or some scholars choose to add 2 additional stages to the 8 stages of genocide, making it 10 stages of genocide. So if you do like Google 8 stages of genocide, sometimes you'll see there are 10 with the addition of discrimination and persecution. So it's up to you. I mean, scholars go back and forth as to whether or not these two are necessary. Some people roll them into other sections of the 8 stages, but I just wanted to make you aware in case you were doing your own research and you're like, hold up, there are 2 extra stages here. So we're going to go over some specific genocides that happened before and after the Holocaust. So we had already talked about the Rwandan genocide in the last section of notes when we talked about Africa. And we're now going to talk quickly about Armenia and Cambodia. So, a mini history lesson here. The Ottoman Empire had ruled for a few hundred years in the area that we know as Northern Africa, the Middle East, and into the Balkan Peninsula. The Balkan Peninsula is where Greece is. I know most of you guys can identify Greece on a map of Europe, so that would be our landmark there. So, the Ottomans, their empire starts to decline around 1900, a little earlier than that, but let's just say, for simplicity's sake, around 1900, the Ottoman Empire starts to decline. And there starts to be all these uprisings in different regions of the Ottoman Empire as the Ottomans remove themselves from that area. And it creates this imbalance in specific regions. And Armenia is one of those places where the imbalance led to genocide. So Turkey is the main ruling hub of the Ottoman Empire. They are the link between all of the land that we know as the Ottoman Empire. And nowadays, that's where that cultural piece comes in. So the Ottoman Empire shrinks and it becomes Turkey. So the Armenians lived in an area that is actually now part of Turkey. For about 2,000 years, they were under control of the Ottoman Empire and they were mostly Christian. But the Ottoman Empire, they were Muslim. And nationalism was sweeping through the Ottoman Empire as there was this like resurgence around 1910, 1915 of rebuilding the Ottoman Empire as World War One was going on. Now, the empire is going to disappear in 1921. It just gets wiped off the map, and all these new countries are born from it. But there was this resurgence of nationalism in order to preserve the culture of what the Ottoman Empire was. And the Armenian genocide is a result of that. The people who were the Ottoman Turks who were controlling Armenia, they persecuted all these Armenian Christians who were living in this region, starved them to death, and like 1.5 million Armenians died as a result of this. Facing History has done an amazing job at collecting videos of all types of really, really horrific things that have happened in history. So there's a really nice video here. I know you're like, well, she just called it horrific, but there's a nice video here about the Armenian genocide, explaining what it is and the conditions of what it was like. So the ambassador here is calling it a race murder that is occurring. And these people, like, look at these kids here on the cover of this, just systematically killed, persecution of Armenians, widespread attempts to uproot this peaceful Armenian population. And again, it was because the Armenian people were a specific ethnic group that was Christian and it was living within the boundary of Turkey, and they just didn't want it there anymore. That the different minority groups were offsetting the balance and the power that was going to be able to be achieved by the Turks by them being present. So they were systematically destroyed. So Armenia, again, I mean, the one thing about this is there was a lot of denial about the Armenian genocide. So when you do your research, if you choose the Armenian genocide, this one's very compelling because of the amount of denial. So actually, here's a video about the denial. So Turkey suspended its military ties with France in 2016 after the French Parliament lower house adopted a bill that would make it a crime to deny the Armenian killings and genocide that was going on here. And actually, only 23 countries across the world actually acknowledged the fact that from 1915 to 1917, 1.5 million Armenians were killed. So in 2007, the United States opened this debate as to whether or not the US, I mean, this is almost 100 years later, would declare the Armenian genocide an actual event. And eventually we did. However, Turkey is a very important ally to the United States. It has always been a link between the United States and the Soviet Union when the Cold War was going on, the United States and the Middle East, to try to create like a buffer zone between. That's essentially what Turkey has tried to do, is be this like political player where are a buffer zone between Europe and the Middle East. And the United States valued that alliance. All right, so there was also a genocide in Bosnia, which again was part of the Ottoman Empire until 1878, and then it was part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire until the First World War. And what happens here again, after the Ottomans abandoned this area, there's a lot of minority groups that were living in these territories, and they were all fighting for power with each other. So there is going to be a genocide of all of these different people. So the Slav territories from Yugoslavia essentially ruled and run by Serbs from the Serbian capital Belgrade. And Yugoslavia was disintegrated in June of 1991. I remember when it was on a map, but it was really to try to create peace in this area by giving all of these different minority groups, like the Bosnians, space from the Slav, like from the Serbians, so that way they wouldn't be killed anymore. So give everybody their own countries, so that way there could be, like I said, peace and not mass killing in these areas. In 1992, Bosnia-Herzegovina had this conflict between their three ethnic groups because these new countries were established. And what happens is the Serbs and the Croats turn against the Muslims. And again, remember, this area was ruled by the Ottoman Empire, which was a Muslim empire. So there was a Muslim presence through any of the areas that were controlled by the Ottoman Turks. And the Bosnians essentially mass killed the Muslims who are living in Bosnia for power control to, racial issues. Again, living conditions in this area were not ideal, and the Muslims essentially took the blame for that. The Muslims were brought by the Ottomans. They were associated with the fall of the empire, the lack of prestige, and it ends with the killing of all of these women and children. People are tortured and starved. In 1994, NATO initiated these airstrikes against Bosnia to get them to stop. And there's a ceasefire that existed in 1995, but it didn't stop like hundreds of thousands of people from being killed during this time. And finally, this is the Cambodian genocide. So the killing fields were a number of sites in Cambodia where large numbers of people were killed and buried by the communist regime. So there's a book about this that was released in 1984 that's a fictional book, but it's a really good interpretation of what was going on. And it was an essentially an event to create a master race of communist, like pro-communist Cambodians. These people were forced to live in these agricultural collectives, and people they were restricted and denied rights to education and things like that. So the massacre ends in 1979 when the communist Vietnam invades the country and topples the Khmer Rouge regime. But it didn't stop them from digging up. So talk about denial. like hundreds and thousands of bodies, bones, skulls. You can see a picture of it there, and just put in these mass graves. So that's the end of genocide in terms of going over specific genocides. But here is a list of other genocides that you might want to research later on this week. There's the one in Namibia, Armenian genocide, which we talked about, the Ukrainian famine, the Nanking massacre. Obviously, we have the Holocaust, the Cambodian genocide we just talked about, the East Timor genocide, the Mayan genocide, Guatemala. In Iraq, there was a genocide that occurred, the Bosnian genocide, the Rwandan genocide, Darfur genocide. There are also other genocides that occurred that aren't on this list, and you are welcome to choose them as well. So that's it for this week.